What I thought I would do with this video is show you a basic introduction to the main phases of the Western Heights. There are many features of the Western Heights and the whole site is very, very complex. So I'm just going to show you some of the more famous and basic features. Not everything, we'll be here all day. So there's a quick sort of 5-10 minute video just to showing you how things developed over the years and give you some idea of the phases of construction. So first of all, before the Western Heights was built, the site was mainly believed probably like farmland. There are only three interesting features that we know of for certain. There was the Roman lighthouse remains, which were still standing to about sort of 12-15 foot high in the late 1770s, which is known as the Braden Stone. We have a 12th century chapel, which legend has it is connected to the Knights Templar. It could be a beacon or a small round church located around about here. And then in 1665, about 900 people in Dover died of the Great Plague, and they were buried in 3 large plague pits which were located around about here. So there wasn't a lot going on by the time that the defences started to be constructed in 1779. In 1779, Britain was at war. The American War of Independence was still going on, and France, being one of America's allies, there was a fear that the French may try and invade England via Dover. So work was decided to begin to fortify the western hills of Dover. Now this was the original plan that was set up. We had the eastern redoubt, a small fort, and the western redoubt, our main fortress, connected up with a defensive line in between. This work was designed by a Captain Thomas Hyde Page, who was the commanding officer of the Royal Engineers. This was the initial plan. Work progressed on these, but was never actually finished. They believe that both forts were plank lined and guard houses were set up in the 2 locations. We had 3 in the what became the Citadel and 1 in the drop redoubt, and we think the guard houses were completed, but the site was never actually finished at all. It was constructed by militia units that came down from all over the country to undertake these. So after peace was declared, and there was very little work took place, and the site was pretty much abandoned until the Napoleonic era. Around the 1790s, a small graveyard was set up, virtually on top of the old plague pits, and that lasted about 60-70 years, known as the Graves. 1803 saw the invasion crisis. Napoleon had brought his troops up to Boulogne and were camped across the fields of northern France. They could even be seen on a clear day with a telescope from the cliffs of Dover and from boats out in the Channel. So now the invasion threat became real again. The government started to go back to the earlier 1779 unfinished works and finish them off as far as they possibly could. So an awful lot of men and militia units were brought down to Dover to begin construction on the heights, which is much more familiar to us today. The works were designed by Brigadier William Twiss, who also designed the Royal Military Canal and the Martello Towers to protect the coast down towards Hythe Romney area. Local construction was supervised by another Royal Engineer officer known as William Ford. And between them, they pretty much came up with the defensive plan that was to form the basis of the Western Heights that we all know these days. So work began in earnest. The drop redoubt was restyled from a 4-sided shape to a pentagon shape, and construction began in 1803. It lasted about 4 or 5 years before it was finished. Between that and the seafront, or on the hill above the seafront, was constructed the Western Heights Barracks, and in 1804, took 2.5 years to build, the Grand Shaft was built, 140-foot triple helix staircase to connect the barrack site with the seafront. On the other side of the hill, the work returned to the Citadel. The Citadel was massive. I mean, you're looking 6-7 times bigger than the redoubt. And casemates were built, and the site was largely constructed, but it was never finished because 1815, Waterloo, the French threat disappeared overnight, and the citadel was then abandoned as unfinished. So it languished for 20, 30 years with very little military activity at all in it. Also worthy of note at this period is the military hospital located down here that was built about 1806, 1807 roughly. In the centre, between the citadel and the redoubt, was a little section here which defended the middle part called North Centre Bastion, protected by cannons, located here, which is at the end of the sports field as it is these days. So throughout the 1820s and 30s, there was very little change in the Western Heights. In fact, there are very few records at all from the 1820s, and not really much altered until the 1850s. Throughout this period, infantry regiments were coming and going, usually staying for about a year or so, then off again, heading off abroad or returning from abroad. So it was a temporary place of stay. So this went through the 1830s into the 40s. 1853, a new gun position was set up to protect the base, of the drop redoubt and near the Grand Shaft Barracks, called Drop Battery, that overlooked the harbour. Then, of course, the Crimean War broke out. And the Crimean War, in the aftermath of that, when the troops were returned, thousands of men were stationed at the Western Heights, having returned back from the war. Most of them were Highlanders. Highland regiments were everywhere at that point. And this is the first time the citadel was occupied, because in 1856 the 42nd Royal Highlanders were encamped in the uncompleted citadel, and that represents the first time there was a proper sort of garrison up there. So matters really changed a lot when in 1858, because Major William Drummond Jervois, who was the Assistant Inspector General of Fortifications, wrote to the Secretary of State for War, putting forward specific proposals for completing and improving the Western Heights. These were accepted, and the works were then designed by Captain Edmund Frederick Duquesne, who was the commanding Royal Engineer at Dover, under general supervision by Jervois. At the same time, in the light of the Crimea War, the Barrack and Hospitals Improvement Committee produced a report on barracks across the UK, and talked about the conditions in the Crimea, why disease had spread and the reasons for it. And they determined that barracks were basically insanitary and unsafe and needed to be improved vastly. And that was in the light of Florence Nightingale's Commission's report that came out. So, in 1859, the Royal Commission for the Defences of the United Kingdom decided to improve the defences in light of perceived French aggression from, Napoleon III, or didn't go out to anything, but at the time didn't know that. They decided to rebuild the heights and incorporate the Barracks and Hospitals Improvements Committee's report into the ongoing new works that had just been approved. So there's two big changes happened then, and that made massive changes to the entire site, and of course other sites as well. So from 1859, a huge wave of rebuilding and modernising then took place, and it lasted sort of 3-4 years. At the east, the Drop Redoubt was modernised with new guns and caponniers projecting into the ditches, and gun rooms were added. North entrance here was rebuilt to make it more defendable. In the centre, North Centre Bastion here was reworked to create an outlying detached bastion, which now became a full defensive position with its own caponnier. That's what a lot of people these days know as Smoky. An entirely new set of barracks was built, a casemated set of barracks called South Front, located here, and that was for about 600 men, so it was roughly half the size of the Western Heights barracks that already existed, which, by the way, was renamed the Grand Shaft Barracks to distinguish it from South Front. At the west, work finally went back into the citadel and it got finished off. An ornate officers' mess was built, and the site was then extended to create the western outworks, ending in a double caponnier at the far end here. And so the site continued largely in this form, with artillery in the redoubt and the citadel, and with 2 infantry battalions now at the Grand Shaft Barracks and South Front, and sometimes the 3rd Battalion at the citadel as well. And it was at this time that Fort Burgoyne was built, or Castle Hill Fort initially, was then built to protect the approach from Canterbury and Deal to Dover Castle. In addition to North Entrance, a second gateway was also built, known as South Entrance. That was located pretty much where the road is by St Martin's Battery today, a very ornate gateway to protect the south direct entrance into the fortifications. In 1874, Drop Battery was slowly phased out and replaced by this new battery at St Martin's. You see it now, go to St Martin's car park, and that's the battery you can see there now. So, following the Heights rebuild in the 1860s, there was very, very few changes took place, at least major structural changes right up until the Second World War. However, the emphasis of the Heights slowly shifted. It shifted away from being a purely defensive site, with the army set out to harass the French wherever they landed, to being more of a station of the British Army. And really, from this point on, we had an endless succession of infantry battalions coming and going, some staying for a year, some staying for 2 years, over these 2 or 3 sites. And they became a major part of the Dover community. A lot of money was made from local businesses and traders from these people, and Dover started to really flourish in the 1860s. There was a huge input of money around about then. But anyway, Napoleon III went into exile in England and died in 1873, but nonetheless the garrison continued, and interestingly, most of the defensive were still set up to fire inland, not necessarily out to sea, because even though there'd been a change in the focus of the Heights, there was still had to have a sort of defensive function as well. So these endless regiments that came and went, there were some quite interesting ones. In 1870, we even had a pet tiger that was kept up at the Citadel up here by the 102nd, who came back from India with it. And 1875, 1877, we had the 2nd Battalion, 24th Warwickshires, who were famed for taking part in East Sandwana and Rorke's Drift in 1879, to name just a couple. So the Heights shifted on. There were very few real changes to it. In 1899, work began on a new emplacement for 3 heavy 9.2-inch guns known as Citadel Battery, and they replaced St Martin's Battery. It's just off the map, but I'll indicate with an arrow roughly where it was. World War I saw very few changes. The main garrison during the First World War was the 3rd Battalion of the East Surreys at the Grand Shaft Barracks. And up at the Citadel we had the 3rd Battalion of the Buffs, the East Kent Regiment. During the 1920s, sections of the Heights that were deemed obsolete or insanitary or replaced by more up-to-date areas in other places were slowly phased out. The Drop Redoubt lost its last garrison around about 1923. South Front was abandoned in 1928, and the hospital was abandoned in favour of Shorncliffe Military Hospital in 1929. World War II saw very few structural changes to the Heights, at least major ones, but it did see the addition of lots of pillboxes on the defensive structures, as you can probably imagine. I've marked the pillboxes on the map with little red dots. The 2 Bs represent barrage balloons, and the orange areas represent the location of minefields. In 1940, South Front Barracks was brought out of retirement to be used by the local infantry, and in 1941 St Martin's Battery was rearmed with some old 6-pounder guns for coastal protection. There was also an anti-aircraft position that was set up here not far from the citadel. The garrison of World War II was very transient. There was lots of different regiments came and went for a few months to, protect it. Then they moved on elsewhere. Generally speaking, they were quite new recruits, fresh recruits, and sometimes as their first place of posting straight out of training was Dover. So there was initially a lot of militia battalions. Later on, other infantry came in en route before they went elsewhere. We also briefly had Lord Lavatt's commandos, 4 Commando, were dropped out in April 1942 to undertake a raid to the coast near Boulogne called Operation Abercrombie. So, apart from that, that was really marks the sort of the final military end of the Western Heights, because by October 1944, all the regular troops had been withdrawn because, of course, D-Day had happened and they're all fighting abroad. Of course, that wasn't the end of the Heights story. What followed next is a little bit of a sad story, really, because we suffer from a lot of demolition. From the period of 1959 through to about 1965, whole swathes of the Western Heights were demolished. We lost the Grandshaft Barracks. We lost the military hospital. We lost the very ornate south entrance. We lost South Front Barracks. We lost the entranceway to the Grand Shaft. We lost the Garrison Church. And Dover Corporation even attempted to fill in the western outworks, the double caponnet at the end, before eventually legal action was brought and it was stopped. So what we're left with is the citadel, detached bastion, which is in quite bad condition, and the drop redoubt, and the north entranceway, which our little preservation society try to look after, those sections. The Grand Shaft and the Grand Shaft Barracks site are owned by Dover District Council. The redoubt is owned by English Heritage, as is North Entrance, and they also own detached bastion. The citadel, after the war, spent a brief time as a prison, then became a borstal for many, many years, all the way through the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, young offenders institution, and then eventually became Dover Immigration Removal Centre. That shut in 2015, and it's now in private hands. The old parade ground, the sports field right in the centre of the Heights, attached to North Centre Bastion, is owned by Dover Town Council, and other sections are owned by different organisations or private individuals and privately owned. So the whole thing is now a patchwork of ownership. So there's hope for the future, though. The Citadel, we'll see what happens with that. And we are still working on the drop redoubt and those areas, and hopefully we'll have them open for many years to come for you to carol and enjoy. So, I hope you enjoyed that whistle-stop look at the Western Heights, a long and complex story, and I apologise if I've missed off your favourite bit, but if I was to do the whole lot, we'd be here forever. But I think you get and I hope that's given you a nice idea of the various phases of development. Thanks ever so watching, and it's a cliche, but please like and subscribe because it helps us publicise what we do. Thanks ever so much, and thank you for watching.